Hi, and welcome to a Kubernetes podcast from Google Special. I'm Craig Box with my once and future guest host, Adam Glick.
Hey, Craig. Great to be back with you.
Thank you. It's great to have you back.
You know, it's been a while. I'm a frequent listener now, and I noticed that, there hasn't been a show in a while. Is something changing?
You can't be that frequent a listener.
I just go and I listen to the back catalog. It warms the cockles of my heart.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. We've done a couple of specials in the last couple of months. The show has been on a small hiatus. There's a very good reason, and now I'm out the other end of it. I thought it might be time to share that with everybody. A few months ago, my family and I hatched a plan that we would move from the UK back to New Zealand for a while. It's quite a complex task to pack up one's house, put everything on a boat. I hope it's on a boat at some point. So the container shortage means it could take a long time for things all to arrive.
And you're doing this during COVID.
Well, that made it all so much more complicated. So my family over here haven't seen my family from the UK for quite some time, and the process required to get here involved a quarantine stay. Thankfully, it was cut down from 2 weeks to just one, but I tell you, staying in a hotel for a week with a little guy is not fun.
Many things are changing with that, but I have to ask the most obvious one, which is, are you going to miss not seeing Ted Lasso in the neighborhood?
Of the many things about Richmond I will miss, the filming of Ted Lasso is high on the list. For those of you who have not seen it, Ted Lasso is an Apple TV Emmy award-winning comedy, which was filmed basically around the corner from where I used to live.
It is absolutely fantastic. The first season of it was just in the tough times in COVID, I would just turn on and watch that. There's not a character you can't love in that show. It's beautiful.
Especially if they're named Roy Kent. I mentioned to Adam before that Roy Kent was my favorite character, and he's like, of course he was. I don't know what makes you think that we'd have such an affinity.
Everyone has their character that they feel that draw towards, and Roy is one of those people that, for any real reason, you look at it you should probably not like them, much like Jamie in the show, but yet you love them because you get to know who they are and how they look at the world. That is one of the amazing, brilliant things about that show. Not to make this the gush over Ted Lasso episode, but oh yeah, just so much goodness.
Yes, and it's a shame to leave many things behind, but I will say that the Airbnb where I have been self-isolating for the last few days has a lot of green and a lot of space, and that's something that's a lot easier to get over here than it is in the UK.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you're in the new location and hope that that's all well. And thank you for sharing it with me and all the people who get to listen.
Indeed. So we will return to something like regular service come January once we've had a chance to settle in. I have to have a summer Christmas between now and then, and those are strange. I'm not going to be used to that.
No snow, no rain, long days. I mean, there's a lot of goodness in that. And thankfully, for those of us that listen like myself, you'll be filling a podcast-type hole that currently sits in my player.
Indeed. On the topic of the news, I would say it's quite convenient that there was KubeCon a couple of months ago now, and there's been not a huge amount of announcements since then. Anything stuck out to you?
There are a number of things that stood out to me. Obviously, Knative being donated to the CNCF was something that I was glad to see. I remember there was a lot of discussion about that previously, and I'm glad to see that that has come to fruition and is in a good place for where it can be and where it can grow. I've also noticed the various different Kubernetes distros that are out there and people are using, and it's great to see a really robust and broad community continue to grow as adoption continues to grow. It's always great to see as a community member.
Well, Adam, it's been a pleasure talking to you again, but right now, let's get to our interview. Rey Lejano is a field engineer at SUSE by way of Rancher Labs and is the release team lead for Kubernetes 1.23, which is out today. Welcome to the show, Ray.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'd like to start with what is, of course, on top of everyone's mind at the moment. Let's talk African clawed frogs.
Oh, you mean Xenophis laevis, the scientific name for African clawed frogs?
Of course.
Not many people know, but my background and my degree is actually in microbiology from the University of California, Davis. And I did some research for about 4 years in biochemistry in a biochemistry lab. And I do have a research paper published, and it's actually on some research on glycoproteins, particularly something called cortical granulectin. We used frogs because they generate lots of eggs that we can extract the protein, and that protein prevents polysperming. So when the sperm goes into an egg, the egg releases a glycoprotein, cortical granulectin, to the membrane and prevents any other sperm from going inside the egg.
Were you able to take anything from the testing that we did on frogs and generalize that to higher order mammals, perhaps?
Yes. Since mammals also have the glycoprotein corticogranulectin, we were able to analyze what the convergence and the evolutionary pattern, not just from multiple species of frogs, but also into mammals as well.
Now, there's a couple of different pathways to unravel here. When you were young, what led you into the fields of biology and perhaps more the technical side of it?
I think it was mostly from family, since I do have a history of family that's in the medical field. That goes back into generations. So I kind of felt like that was the natural path going into college.
Now, of course, you're working in a more abstract tech field. What led you sort of out of microbiology?
Well, I've always been interested in tech. Taught myself a little programming when I was younger, in high school or before high school. Did some web dev stuff. Just kind of got burnt out being in a lab. It was literally in the basement. Once I had this great opportunity to join this consultancy that specialized in ITIL. I actually started off with application performance management, went into monitoring, went into operations management, and also ITIL, which is aligning your IT asset management and service management with business services. Did that for a good number of years, actually.
It's very interesting as people describe the things that they went through and perhaps the technologies that they worked on. You can pretty much pinpoint how old they might be. There's a lot of people who come into tech these days. They've never heard of ITIL. They've got no idea what it is. It's basically just sort of SRE with more process.
Yes, absolutely. It's not very cloud native. I would say.
Not at all.
You don't really hear about it in cloud native landscape. Definitely can tell if someone's been in the field for a little bit, if they specialize or have worked with ITIL before.
You mentioned that you wanted to get out of the basement. That is quite often where people put the programmers. Did they just give you better lighting in the new basement?
They did. They gave us much better lighting, able to get some vitamin D sometimes as well.
To wrap up the discussion about your previous career, over the course of the last year and all of the things that have happened in the world, I could imagine that microbiology skills may be more in demand than perhaps they were when you studied them.
Oh, absolutely. I could definitely see a big increase of numbers of people going into the field. Also, reading what's going on with the world currently kind of brings back all the education I've learned in the past as well.
Do you keep in touch with people you went through school with?
Just some close friends, but not in the microbiology field.
All right.
Definitely from college, but they all were in different fields.
Now, one thing that I think will probably happen as a result of the pandemic is a renewed interest in some of these STEM fields, and that will be interesting to see what impact that has on society at large.
Yeah, I think that would be great.
So you mentioned working at a consultancy, doing IT management, application performance monitoring, and so on. When did Kubernetes come into your professional life?
So one of my good friends from that company left in about mid-2015. Mm-hmm. He went on to a company that was pretty heavy with Docker. Mm-hmm. He taught me a little bit. So I did my first Docker run around 2015, maybe 2016. Then one of the applications we were using for the ITIL framework was containerized around 2018 or so. Also on Kubernetes, but at that time it was pretty buggy for the application being containerized running on Kubernetes. So that was my first actual initial introduction to Kubernetes and containerized applications. Then I left that company and I actually joined my friend over at RXM, which is a cloud native consultancy and training firm. They specialize in Docker and Kubernetes. So I was able to get my hands wet, got my CKD, got my CKA as well. And they were really, really great into encouraging us to learn more about Kubernetes and also being involved in the community.
You will have seen then the life cycle of people adopting Kubernetes and containerization at large through your own initial journey and then through helping customers. How would you characterize how that journey has changed from the early days to perhaps today?
So I think the early days, there's a lot of questions of why do I have to containerize? Why can't I just stay with virtual machines?
It's a line item on your CV.
It is. And nowadays, I think people know the value of using containers, of orchestrating containers with Kubernetes. I don't want to say jumping on the bandwagon, but it's become the de facto standard to orchestrate containers.
It's not something that a consultancy needs to go out and pitch to customers that they should be doing. They're just sort of taking it as that will happen and starting a bit further down the path, perhaps.
Absolutely.
Working at a consultancy like that, how much time do you get to work on improving process perhaps for multiple customers and then looking at how you can upstream that work versus paid work that you do for just an individual customer at a time?
Back then, it would kind of vary. They helped me introduce myself, and I learned a lot about the cloud native landscape and Kubernetes itself. They helped educate me into how the cloud native landscape and the tools around the cloud native landscape kind of merges together. Mm-hmm. My boss at that company, Randy, he actually encouraged us to start contributing to Upstream and encouraged me to join the release team. He just said, this is a great opportunity. Definitely helped me with starting with the contributions early on.
Was the release team the way that you got involved with Upstream Kubernetes contribution?
Actually, no. My first contribution was actually with SigDocs. So I met Taylor Dolezal. He was the release team lead for 119, but he also is involved with SigDocs as well. And so I met him at KubeCon 2019. I sat at his table during a luncheon. I remember Paris Pittman was hosting this luncheon at the Marriott. And Taylor says he was involved with SigDocs. He encouraged me to join. So I started joining the meetings, started doing a few drive-by PRs. So that's what we call them, drive-by, like little typo fixes. Then did a little bit more, started to do better quality or higher quality pull requests and also reviewing now.
When did you first formally take a release team role?
That was in 118. In December, my boss at the time encouraged me to apply. I did, was lucky enough to get accepted for the release notes shadow. Mm-hmm. Then from there, stayed in with release notes for a few cycles, then went into docs, naturally, then led docs, then went to enhancements. Now am the release lead for 123.
I don't know that a lot of people think about what goes into a good release note. What would you say does?
You have to tell the end user what has changed or what effect that they might see in the release notes. It doesn't have to be highly technical. It could just be a few lines and just seeing what has changed, what they have to do, if they have to do anything as well.
As you moved through the process of shadowing, how did you learn from the people who were leading those roles?
I said this a few times when I was the release lead for this cycle. You get out of the release team as much as you put in, or it directly aligns to how much you put in. I learned a lot. I went into the release team having that mindset of learning from the role leads, learning from the other shadows as well. Mm-hmm. That's actually a saying that my first role lead told me. I still carry it to heart, and that was back in 118. That was Eddie in the very first meeting we had, and I still carry it to heart.
You, of course, were the release lead for 123. First of all, congratulations on the release.
Thank you very much.
The theme for this release is The Next Frontier. Tell me the story of how we came to the theme and then the logo.
The Next Frontier represents a few things. It not only represents the next enhancements in this release, but Kubernetes itself also has a history of Star Trek references. The original codename for Kubernetes was Project 7, a reference to 7 of 9, originally from Star Trek Voyager. Also the 7 spokes in the helm and the logo of Kubernetes as well. And of course, Borg, the predecessor to Kubernetes. The Next Frontier continues that Star Trek reference, also a fusion of 2 titles in the Star Trek universe. One is Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, and the Star Trek The Next Generation.
Do you have any opinion on the fact that Star Trek V was an odd-numbered movie and they are canonically referred to as being less than the even-numbered ones?
I can't say because I am such a sci-fi nerd that I love all of them, even though it's bad. Even the post-Next Generation movies after the series, I still liked all of them, even though I know some weren't that great.
Am I right in remembering that Star Trek V was the one directed by William Shatner?
Yes, that is correct.
I think that says it all.
Yes.
Now, I understand that the theme comes from a part of the SIG release charter.
Yes, there's a line in the SIG release charter. Ensure there is a consistent group of community members in place to support the release process across time. So with the release team, we have new shadows that join every single release cycle. With this, we're growing with this community. We're growing the release team members. We're growing SIG release. We're growing the Kubernetes community itself. For a lot of people, this is their first time contributing to open source. So that's why I kind of say it's their new open source frontier.
And the logo was obviously very Star Trek inspired. It sort of surprised me that it took that long for someone to go this route.
I was very surprised as well. I had to relearn Adobe Illustrator to create the logo.
This is your own work, is it?
This is my own work.
It's very nice.
Thank you very much. Funny, the Galaxy actually took me the longest time versus that ship. It took me a few days to get that correct. I'm always fine-tuning it, so there might be a final change when this is actually released.
No frontier is ever truly final.
True. Very true.
Moving now from the theme of the release to the substance, perhaps, what is new in 123?
We have 47 enhancements. I'm going to run through most of the stable ones, if not all of them. Also some of the key beta ones and a few of the alpha enhancements for 123. One of the key ones is dual stack IPv4, IPv6 went to stable in 123. Well, some background info. Dual stack was introduced as alpha in 115. You probably saw a keynote at KubeCon 2019. Back in alpha in 115, the way dual stack worked was that you needed two services to actually do dual stack. You need a service per IP family. So you need a service for IPv4 and a service for IPv6. Mm-hmm. It was refactored in 120. So 121, it was in beta. Clusters were enabled to be dual stack by default. And in 123, we do remove the IPv6 dual stack feature flag. It's not mandatory to use dual stack. It's actually a default still. The pods and services still default to single stack. There are some requirements to be able to use dual stack. The nodes have to be routable to IPv4 and IPv6 network interfaces. Still, you need a CNI plugin that supports dual stack. The pods itself have to be configured to be dual stack, and the services need the IP family policy field to specify preferred dual stack or required dual stack.
This sounds like there's an implication in this that v4 is still required. Do you see a world where we can actually move to v6 only clusters?
I think we'll be talking about IPv4 and IPv6 for many, many years to come. I remember a long time ago, they kept saying it's going to be all IPv6, and that was decades ago.
I think I may have mentioned on the show before, but there was a meeting in London that Vint Cerf attended, and he gave a public presentation at the time to say, now is the time of v6, and that was 10 years ago or something, and it's still not the time of v6, and my desktop here still doesn't have Linux on it. So one day.
My opinion, that's one of the big key features that went stable for 123. One of the other highlights of 123, it's pod security admission going to beta. I know this feature is going to beta, but I highlight this because as some people might know, pod security policies, which was deprecated in 121, it is targeted to be removed in 125. So pod security admission places pod security policy. And pod security admission is admission controller and evaluates the pods against the predefined set of pod security standards to either admit or deny the pod from running. There's 3 levels of pod security standards: privilege that's totally open, baseline to known privilege escalations are minimized, or restricted, that which is hardened. And you could set pod security policies to be either to run in 3 modes, which is enforce, to reject any pods that are in violation, to audit, so the pods are allowed to be created, but the violations are recorded, or warn, so it will send a warning message to the user and the pod is allowed.
You mentioned there that pod security policy is due to be deprecated in 2 releases' time. Are we lining up these features so that pod security admission will be GA at that time?
Yes, absolutely. And I'll talk about that for another feature in a little bit as well. And there's also another feature that went to GA. It was an API that went to GA, and therefore the beta API is now deprecated. I'll talk about that in a little bit.
All right, let's talk about what's next on the list.
Let's move on to more stable enhancements. One is the TTL controller. So this cleans up jobs and pods after the jobs are finished. There is a TTL timer that starts when the job or pod is finished. This TTL controller watches all the jobs. And you could set a time for this TTL time, and it's the TTL seconds after finish needs to be set. So the controller will see if the TTL seconds after finish combined with the last transition time, if it's greater than now. If it is, then it will delete the job and the pods of that job.
Loosely could be called a garbage collector?
Yes, garbage collector for pods and jobs, or jobs and pods.
If Kubernetes is truly becoming a programming language, it of course does have to have a garbage collector implemented.
Yeah, there's another one too, coming in alpha.
Tell me about that.
So that one is coming in alpha. It's actually one of my favorite features because there's only a few that I'm going to highlight today. That is the PVCs for stateful sets will be cleaned up. Mm-hmm. You know, if you auto-delete PVCs created by stateful sets, if you delete that stateful set.
All right, what's next on our tour of stable features?
Next one is skip volume ownership change goes to stable. So this is from SIG storage. There are times when you're running stateful application, like many databases, they're sensitive to permission bits changing underneath. Currently, when a volume is bind mounted inside the container, the permissions of that volume will change recursively. It might take a really long time. Now there's a field, the FS group change policy, so it allows you as a user to tell Kubernetes how you want the permission and ownership change for that volume to happen. So you can set it to always change permissions, or just on root mismatch to only do it when the permission and ownership changes at the top level is different from what is expected.
It does feel like a lot of these enhancements came from a very particular use case where someone said, hey, this didn't work for me, and I've plumbed in a feature that works for exactly the thing I need to have.
Absolutely. People create issues for these, then create Kubernetes enhancement proposals, and then get targeted for releases.
Another GA feature in this release, ephemeral volumes.
We've always been able to use empty-dir for ephemeral volumes, but now we could actually have ephemeral inline volumes, meaning that you could take your standard CSI driver and be able to use ephemeral volumes with your standard CSI driver.
And a long time coming, cron jobs.
Cron jobs is a funny one because cron jobs is stable before 123. For 123, it was tracked still, but it was just cleaning up some of the old controller. So in cron jobs, there's a V2 controller. So what was cleaned up in 123 is just the old V1 controller. And
were there any other deprecations or major cleanups of note in this release?
Yeah, there were a few you might see in the major themes. One's a little tricky one. It's called flex volumes. So this is one of the efforts from SIG Storage. SIG Storage has an effort to migrate Inchi plugins to CSI drivers. Mm-hmm. This is a little tricky one because flex volumes was actually deprecated in November 2020. We're formally announcing it in 123.
Flex volumes, in my mind, predate CSI as a concept. So it's about time to get rid of them.
Yes, it is. There's another deprecation, just some Klog specific flags. But other than that, there's no other big deprecation, 123.
The buzzword of the last KubeCon, and in some ways the theme of the last 12 months, has been secure software supply chain. What work is Kubernetes doing to improve in this area?
For 123, Kubernetes is now SASA level compliance level 1, which means that the Providence attestation files that describe the staging and release phases of the release process is satisfactory to the SASA framework.
What needs to happen to step up to further levels?
Level 1 means a few things: that the build is scripted, that the provenance is available, meaning that the artifacts are verified and they're handed over from one phase to the next. It describes how the artifact is produced. So level 2 means that the source is version controlled, which it is. Provenance is authenticated. Provenance is service generated, and there is a build service. So that's for level 2. There's 4 levels of SASA compliance.
It does seem like the levels were largely influenced by what it takes to build a big secure project like this. And so it doesn't seem like it will take a lot of extra work to move up to for verifiable provenance, for example. There's probably just a few lines of script required to meet many of those requirements.
Absolutely. I feel like we're almost there, so we'll see what will come out of 124. And I do want to give a big shout out to SIG Release and Release Engineering, primarily to Adolfo Garcia Vetia, who's aka Puerco on GitHub and on Slack. He's been driving this forward.
You've mentioned some APIs that are being graduated in time to replace their deprecated version. Tell me about the new HPA API.
The Horizontal Pod Autoscaler V2 API is now stable, which means that the V2 Beta 2 API is deprecated. Just for everyone's knowledge, the V1 API is not being deprecated. The difference is that the V2 adds support for multiple and custom metrics to be used for HPA.
There's also now a facility to validate my CRDs with an expression language.
Yeah, you could use a common expression language, or CEL, to validate your CRDs. You no longer need to use webhooks. So this also makes the CRDs more self-contained and declarative because the rules are now kept within the CRD object definition.
What new features, perhaps coming in alpha or beta, have taken your interest?
Aside from pod security policies, I really love ephemeral containers. So this supports kube control debug. So launches an ephemeral container in a running pod, shares those pod namespaces, so you could do all your troubleshooting with just running kube control debug.
There's also been some interesting changes in the way that events are handled with kubectl.
Yeah, kube control events has always had some issues, like things weren't sorted. So now kube control events improves that. So now you could do a -- watch option, and it will also sort with the watch option as well. The default of kube control events, it will sort those events for you, which is something new. You could actually combine fields and custom columns. And also you could list events in the timeline with doing like the last n number of minutes. And you could also sort events using other criteria as well.
You are a field engineer at SUSE. Are there any things that are coming in that your individual customers that you deal with are looking out for?
More of what I look out for to help the customers.
Right.
I really love kube control events, really love the stateful sets, the PVCs being cleaned up with stateful sets. So most of it's for selfish reasons that it will improve troubleshooting efforts.
I have always hoped that a release team lead would say to me, yes, I have selfish reasons and I finally got something I wanted in. Perhaps I should run to be release team lead just so I can finally get init containers fixed once and for all.
Oh, init containers, I've been looking for that for a while. I've actually created animated GIFs on how init containers will be run with that Kubernetes enhancement proposal, but it's halted currently.
One day.
Maybe I shouldn't say halted.
You mentioned there, obviously, the things you look out for. Are there any things that are coming down the line, perhaps alpha features or maybe even just proposals you've seen lately that you're personally really looking forward to seeing which way they go?
Yeah, so one is a very interesting one. It affects the whole community, so it's not just for personal reasons. As you may have known, Docker shim is deprecated, and we did release a blog that it will be removed in 1.24.
Scared a bunch of people.
From a survey, we saw that a lot of people are still using Docker and Docker shim. One of the enhancements for 1.23 is kubelet CRI goes to beta. So this promotes the CRI API, which is required. So this had to be in beta for Docker shim to be removed in 1.24.
Now, in the last release team lead interview, we spoke with Savitha Ranganathan, and she talked about what she would advise you as her successor, and it was to look out for the mental health of the team members. How were you able to take that advice on board?
That was great advice from Savitha. A few things I've made note of with each release team meeting. So after each release team meeting, I do stop the recording because we do record all the meetings and post them on YouTube. And I open up the floor to anyone who wants to say anything that's not recorded, that's not going to be on the agenda. Mm-hmm. Also, people not to work on weekends. I broke this rule once, but other than that, I told people they could wait. Just be mindful of your mental health.
It's just been announced that James Leverack from JetStack will be the release team lead for 1.24. I'm pretty sure James and I shared an interesting Mexican dinner at the last KubeCon in San Diego.
Oh, nice. I didn't know you knew James.
The British tech scene, it's a very small world. What will your advice to James be?
What I would tell James for 1.24 is use teachable moments in the release team meetings. When you're shadow for the first time, it's very daunting. It's very difficult because you don't know the repos. You don't know the release process. Everyone around you seems like they know what the release process and very familiar with the release process is. But as a first-time shadow, you don't know all the vernacular for the community. Mm-hmm. I just advise to use teachable moments, take a few minutes in the release team meetings to make it a little easier for new shadows to ramp up and to be familiar with the release process.
Has there been major evolution in the process in the time that you've been involved, or do you think that it's effectively doing what it needs to do?
It's always evolving. So initially with release notes, I remember my first time in release notes 1.18, we said that our goal was to automate and program our way out so that we don't have a release notes team anymore. That's changed quite a bit, although there's been significant advancements in the release notes process by Adolfo and also James. They've created a subcommand in Krell to generate release notes but nowadays, although release notes is richer, still not there at the automation process yet. Every release cycle, there's something a little bit different. So for this release cycle, we had a production readiness review deadline. That was a soft deadline. A production readiness review is a review by several people in the community. It's actually been required as of 1.21, and it ensures that the enhancements are observable, scalable, supportable, and it's safe to operate in production and can also be disabled or rolled back. So 1.23, we had a deadline to have the production readiness review completed by a specific date.
How have you found the change of schedule to 3 releases per year rather than 4?
Moving to 3 releases a year from 4, in my opinion, has been improvement because we do support the last 3 releases, and now we can actually support the last releases in a calendar year instead of having 9 months out of 12 months of the year.
The next event on the calendar is a Kubernetes contributor celebration starting next Monday, December 13. What can we expect from that event?
This is our second time running this virtual event. It's a virtual celebration to recognize the whole community and all of our accomplishments of the year and also contributors. So there's a number of events during this week of celebration. So it starts the week of December 13th. There's events like the Kubernetes Contributor Awards, where SIGs honor and recognize the hard work of the community and contributors. There's also a DevOps party game as well. There's a Cloud Native Bake-Off. I do highly suggest people to go to kubernetes.dev/celebration to learn more.
How exactly does one judge a virtual bake-off?
That I don't know.
I tasted my scones. I think they're the best. I rate them 10 out of 10.
Yeah, that is very difficult to do virtually. I would have to say probably what the dish is, how closely is tied with Kubernetes or open source or the CNCF. There's a few judges. I know Josh Burkus and Rin are a few of the judges running the bake-off.
Yes, we spoke with Josh about his love of the kitchen, and so he seems like a perfect fit for that role.
He is.
Finally, your wife and yourself are expecting your first child in January. Have you had a production readiness review for that?
I think we failed that review.
There's still time.
We are working on refactoring, so we're going to refactor a little bit in December and apply again.
Well, congratulations on both the release and the upcoming bundle of joy, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
You can find Ray on Twitter at Rey Lejano. Well, I can't think of anyone I would have rather had as my very special guest for this final special episode before regular service returns next year, so thank you very much, Adam, for joining me today.
Oh, it was my pleasure, Craig. Thank you for having me back on.
Anytime.
And for all you listening, if you enjoyed this show, please help us spread the word and tell a friend. If you have any feedback, you can find the show on Twitter at KubernetesPod or reach it by email at kubernetespodcast@google.com.
You can also check out the website at kubernetespodcast.com, where you will find transcripts and show notes, as well as links to subscribe. I'll be back in the new year, so until then, thanks for listening.
Happy holidays and have a great new year.